I'm here today to present Where Few Designs Have Gone Before, Lessons I've Learned in Digital Instrument Design from Star Trek. And first off, I'd like to say thank you very much to ADC for inviting me, and even more for saying yes to this topic. I do appreciate it. So, for those of you that don't know me, my name's Astrid. And I'm a designer, a developer, and an instrument maker. I tried to make this like butcher, baker, candlestick maker. I couldn't do it, so that's the best I can do. I'm also a music technology researcher at Ableton in Berlin. And I'm also a founding member of the team that built Bella.io and continues to build Bella.io, which is an embedded hardware platform. And in this talk, the talk is in 4 parts. First of all, I'm going to talk about Star Trek instruments, because there's a lot of them, and how I got interested in them, and what really grabbed me about these things. And what I found out about one instrument in particular that really grabbed me. And then the process of prototyping that instrument, and then some of the things I learned through that whole process. So part 1 is discovering Trek instruments. Now, my doctoral research was on digital musical instruments, building digital musical instruments, and as a result, I pay really close attention to musical instruments whenever I see them. And there's a lot of instruments in science fiction because it's a general assumption that making music is an integral part of all culture, not just human culture. And sometimes these are kind of believable. You're like, all right, yeah, I can see how that's an instrument. And sometimes they're really ridiculous. But something happened in March 2020. Now, I don't know if you remember where you were in March 2020, but I sure do, because as we all know, that was the beginning of the pandemic. And everything was canceled. We were all stuck at home, and nobody knew how long it would last. And I remember having a conversation with my partner, and I said to him, we should probably find something on Netflix that's consistently fun to watch, that has a ton of episodes and isn't too depressing, because we could be here for 2 months. Yeah, adorable. And what has lots of episodes, is consistently fun to watch, and not too depressing? It's Star Trek. So we decided to rewatch Star Trek starting from the beginning. And I hadn't mainlined that much Star Trek in many years, and because of this orientation I have towards musical instruments, I could not get over how many musical instruments there were in the show. And the more I watched, the more I realized that these musical instruments served an important storytelling purpose. They are all sometimes different, but there was always a storytelling purpose. And in the original series, the musical instruments are a bit silly, a bit of lighthearted entertainment. But it seems that the musical instruments are used to say something about humans as well as about the aliens the humans encounter. In the original series, most instruments show us something about Vulcan culture. These are Vulcan bells, and there was this really sweet part in, I don't know if anyone's seen Strange New Worlds. It's so good, you should watch it, the brand new series. It involves a young Spock, and he has one of these on his bedroom wall. I thought that was really adorable. But mostly these instruments look a lot like human folk instruments, and that draws a parallel between Vulcan culture and human culture. And ultimately, the instruments start out as giving us this larger cultural context for Vulcans, mostly that they like ritual, and apparently they like a good folk jam. And I also like how Spock's Vulcan harp has little knobs on it. It's an old antique, but it's also high tech, which says something about how long Vulcans have had sophisticated technology. But the musical instruments really come into their own during the Next Generation. It started in 87, went till 94, and they also feature in Voyager, which ran from 95 to 2001. There's also a bunch in Deep Space Nine, best track, but they're mostly Bajoran instruments, so I mean, there's their own thing. So I'm gonna talk mostly about TNG instruments with a little bit of Voyager. And like the original series, there's music is used as this like lighthearted sort of comic relief, but there's also this notion that music symbolizes intelligence, and that certain humans are very intelligent because they play music. And many of the characters in Starfleet play instruments, which I think is an effort to communicate this well-roundedness. They're genius scientists, but they're also musical. And weirdly, the repertoire of highbrow music, like worthy, good, valuable music in the 25th century seems to mirror pretty perfectly highbrow, high value, worthy music in the late 20th century. But that's a whole other talk. On Voyager, Harry Kim plays this ancient thing. We all know that Riker loves a trombone. Even Picard plays the penny whistle. And there's this really interesting part in TNG. It's at the end. He gets a girlfriend. And the way that they kind of communicate that she's on his intellectual level is that she has this rubber roll-up piano, and they go and she like unrolls it in the Jeffries tube, and they're gonna like play together. And I was a little kid when I saw this. I was obsessed with this roll-up piano, obsessed. And but she's definitely on his level because they play together in the Jeffries tube. Very romantic. And there's also this idea that music equals humanity. It's used to communicate that non-humans are, in fact, have human nature. Data is the ultimate example of this. He's an android. He's constantly subjecting his fellow crew members to concerts. I mean, everyone looks really bored. But music is one of many ways that he uses to try to understand human nature and try to incorporate it somehow. And again, the ancient instrument playing, like ancient instruments playing ancient repertoire, is a strong cultural signifier. And it's interesting, still again, how humanity's it's an interesting vision of humanity's future, that there's really been no progress in what we consider to be really important canonical music in a good 500 years. But also, most importantly, there is this idea of music showing, actually, this is second most important. I'll get to the most important afterwards. Got ahead of myself. It shows a futuristic human culture, what happens to human culture as it evolves. And what is recognizable as music. This is one of my favorite episodes. And in this episode, Picard visits the Parisian cafe, and there's a wandering accordion player. And this is what an accordion looks like in 500 years. This thing. For real. I'm serious? Yeah, This is an accordion. It sounds exactly like an accordion. The sound hasn't evolved at all. And now it's tubes attached to like some sort of car grill, I think, I guess to suggest that it's like somehow acoustic and air moves through it. I didn't have time to put the good story in this talk, but if you're interested in this history of this instrument, catch me later. So in this scene, Picard looks out in this futuristic Paris, and there's like a hyperloop going underneath the Eiffel Tower, and it's all like future, future, future. So this is like a vision of how humanity still stays consistent, yet evolves somehow, I guess. And there's also the most important function, we got there eventually, is how music symbolizes culture that's human-ish. And other alien species, if they have music, this is how the writers kind of symbolize this is sophisticated alien culture that doesn't just want to kill everybody. They have, their culture. They have music. So there's a lot of examples of this. The Betazoid chime, played by one of the greatest bit players in Trek history, Mr. Hom. And it's this weird, tiny glass chime that he barely touches. It makes this enormous noise that everybody hates. It's how Beta Zeds give thanks for the food that they eat. There's also this Algolian percussion instrument, which is like these chains of bones hanging down, and this guy hits them with little hammers. How those resonate, no idea. I guess physics evolves too. And but it's a good thing they did, because otherwise, how was Riker going to signal to the Enterprise when he was kidnapped by the Ferengis? But you got to watch season 3, episode 24. And there's also this good one. This one is amazing from Voyager. It's an Inaran musical instrument. Inarans are like this telepathic kind of people. And the Inarans play this musical instrument. They play it with their minds. And to be honest, I don't understand why they have to wave their hand over this weird orb if they're telepathic and they're playing it with their mind. It makes no sense. But a lot of these, they don't make any sense, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. They're just storytelling devices. And so there was one instrument, and this is part 2, the instrument that I really got into and that I found really exciting. And it's this one. There is no instrument that is quite as good as the Aldean, it's an unnamed Aldean instrument. And this is from season 1, episode 16, called When the Bow Breaks. And what happens is all the children on the Enterprise are kidnapped by these Aldeans, who are all pretty old, because they don't have any young people. They haven't been able to reproduce for a long time. So they just steal the Enterprise's children. But they're really nice to them. And they kind of distribute the children among all of these different families. And this little girl ends up with this family of musicians. And they teach her to play this instrument. And spoiler alert, it was an environmental toxin all along. They're fine now. But also, I don't know if you noticed what's in the background here of this Aldean musician. Oh, it's a Vulcan harp. So that's also symbolizing the Aldeans obviously are very sophisticated. They have contact with other alien races for a long time. They can incorporate other alien cultures. Fascinating. But anyway, this instrument, and it's on screen for a total of about 4 seconds. It's this weird kind of disc thing that you put your hand on, and then it reads your moods. It reads your thoughts are translated through this instrument. And it makes sparkly noises, makes noises that reflect the nature of your thoughts. And I found this interesting for a bunch of reasons. First of all, it looks really cool. I was just like, that thing is really exciting to look at. Secondly, it's on camera for 4 seconds, so like you don't even get a good look at it. So that was interesting. I was like, ooh, you have to make up all kinds of stuff. It reads moods. How does one do that? But this is also the only instrument in the entirety of Star Trek that has a design credit. And I found this out by research, because I was like, I need to know who designed these instruments. Nobody has any idea except this one. And this was designed by a guy called Andrew Probert, who, has anyone heard of Andrew Probert? That's what I thought, but I guarantee you've seen his work. He's a production designer through the late 70s till he's still working now. He designed the bridge for The Next Generation. He worked on Battlestar Galactica in the 70s and the reboot in the early 2000s. He designed the DeLorean for Back to the Future. He did most of the production design on Airwolf. He's done basically any kind of mainstream science fiction he seems to have had something to do with. And I found his website, so I sent him an email. And I was like, so, Mr. Probert, what do you know about this instrument? Do you remember it? Can you tell me anything about it? I really want to know. And very kindly, he replied to me and said, can't remember a thing. But I found, scanned, and attached my production design sketch. And I was like, whoa, you need to go to his website. Don't look at your phones right now. I'll put a link at the end of the talk. And his drawings are so beautiful. And this got me really excited because I was like, oh, that is such a cool looking thing. How would you achieve that shape? What would you make that out of? Oh, look at the lights on the side, so cool. So that's when I got really, really super, super into it. And I realized that there was something happening here that usually, and I'm an instrument designer that tries to build unusual instruments, unusual materials, shapes, dimensions, that sort of thing, really push the material and physical aspects. But I realized that my design thinking is always guided by this question. What are the affordances of the technology that I have available? Luckily, today we have a lot of small, embeddable, very powerful computers that you can do the sensor and sound processing on. But still, it's about like, well, what sensors do I have? And increasingly, it's about what can I get my hands on? Because we're all familiar with the chip shortage. And so I realized, even though I try to buck these trends, I'm always kind of thinking about this. Whereas this was not the point of this exercise. I realized that if I was going to do something with this instrument, I had to think about how do I achieve the vibe that the designer imagined, that they intended. Because they didn't even design the sound. They had no regard for whether it would actually work. They didn't care what it sounded like. These are storytelling visual devices. They're props. But they do make sound. They did like weird sort of, I think the best adjective is vague sound design for all of these instruments. Go back and listen to them. You'll know what I mean. And so that got me really interested because I was like, this is kind of flipping all this on its head. I need to forget about the technology because the designers forgot about the technology. They didn't care. So then focus on what is it doing as an object? What life does it have in the world? So now I'm going to tell you what I did to build it. And I feel like I need disclaimers all over this talk because we all know what Trek fans are like, don't we? Don't we, fellow nerds? Yes, I know. And so I thought, okay, here, I need to tell you that this is a design exploration. I wasn't looking to perfectly recreate this. That's not the point. The point was, how do I achieve this vibe? What can I do for the vibe? So if you want to come at me in Discord later, my @ is Bobby Lombardi. I'm joking. You'll find me. So this is a design exploration. This is a prototypical kind of thing. So the goal was build an instrument that reflects the player's mood that kind of looks like the original design. That's what I wanted to do. And so I had to ask myself, well, what does it mean to read someone's moods? And I kept having people say, well, are you going to use like brainwave processing? Or are you going to like, I don't know, how are you going to read somebody's mind? And it kind of started to make me worried because I was thinking, well, oh, am I underthinking this? And I was like, well, doesn't the body sort of express moods in all kinds of ways? And this whole kind of like read minds, I was like, nah. They also don't say that in the episode. They say it reflects your thoughts. They don't say it reads your mind. So I was like, meh. And then something very interesting happened. And I'm not on social media much anymore, but somebody messaged me on Instagram, so I wanted to check the message. And I do not install any social media app of any kind on my phone. I only use it through the browser. So I'm looking at the message, and as I was trying to reply to the person, I dropped my phone on the sofa, and I got this error message. Rage shake. Want to report a bug? Don't forget to take a screenshot. Oh, I took a screenshot. I couldn't believe this. I was like, what am I at? It was like, amazing. So I guess like Instagram thinks that I'm doing this when I use their product, which I guess in many ways is true. but it occurred to me that maybe my instinct here that like sensing mood could be done in various ways. There's like other things that we can sense instead of like somebody's mood, but maybe a little more elegantly than Instagram. So I started off with a Bella, which is a Bella Mini, which is a tiny little embedded, very powerful processor for sensors and sound. And I also explored using an analog accelerometer. The reason I really like analog accelerometers is, and this is not a plug for Bella, it's just something that I find really powerful in instrument design, so I want to tell you. Analog accelerometers, you're kind of limited what you can do with them if you use kind of like Arduino, stuff like that. However, if you have really high resolution analog sensing and a powerful enough computer, you can start doing really interesting filtering. And that's where I think analog accelerometers get really, really powerful for gesture recognition, all kinds of stuff like that. So try it out with the high performance sensing system of your choice. But I think there's a lot more to accelerometers than the way they're usually applied. And I also used a Trill bar, which is a capacitive touch sensor, also made by Bella. And the reason I used it was not because I had a bunch around the house, I guess that was part of it, but also it detects multi-touch and it also reports touch size. And I was like, so that can tell you how hard you're gripping something. Interesting. So that was kind of what I did. And so I made a digital mock-up that was really just messing around with the circle and going, well, what I guess would this kind of thing sort of look like? And I did this at Exhane, which is a hack space in Berlin. If you are in Berlin, please visit. It's fabulous. It's a really, really good place. And I will tell you this interesting story. Every time somebody came into the hack space over the last few weeks, and I've been working on this, they go, oh, cool, what is that? And I found that the younger they were, I would say, do you watch much Star Trek? And the younger they were, the more likely they were to say, I've never heard of that show. So I take you live to how that made me feel. And now you can feel that way too and join me in that. And please, if you have children, please tell them about Star Trek. But anyway, so what I did with this was I laser cut layers and layers of paper and glued it together. And now I will show you the prototype. So it's not an Ableton push. How good a troll would that be? It was just the best box that I had. It's a great box. So this is the instrument here, which looks something like the original. Let me just turn it on. Look at that. It's really prototypey. Look at that. So much hot glue. You're not going to believe it. So while this boots up, so this is just layers of I find paper to be a very versatile material for prototyping instruments because you can laser cut it very, very nicely. Would you like me to hold it up? Yes. I'm afraid it's going to fall apart. So, is this high enough? All right. So what I do with this, a common technique is using layers and layers of paper and then sandwiching them together. You can get nice curves. You can sort of get a prototypey feel for it. It's also really cheap, so if you mess it up, it's not a tragedy. And on the side, these just acrylic panels that I covered with little bits of tissue paper to kind of mimic the colored sections. So, oh, it's on now. So let me get my business in order. Okay. So what it does, what I really prototyped was I started off, I think there's a lot more to do on this instrument, but at this point I was thinking, well, what does it mean to grip something? What does like even your hands on an instrument mean? And so I kind of did this thing where it would make a sound for each finger that you put on it. And if you laid them on very gently, it sounds lovely. But if you start to grip it, it gets like a little kind of, I don't like it. The other thing that I did was thought about with the accelerometer stuff is like, what does it mean to if it, is shaken, if it's rage shook? To quote Instagram. How did that end up in production? I want an explanation. If you work for Meta, please find me. But the interesting thing is that it's quite hard to, it's straightforward. You put your kind of fingers down and there it goes. You can sort of like do some stuff by gripping it when the touch size controls just the volume of each of these voices. And this is mimicking the very, very basic sound design that was in the show. As I said, the sound design is vague. It kind of does this, and then it plays a little sparkly sound. I'm really interested to give it a better musical life. That's my next phase of this. But what I have is this kind of sort of 4-part harmony, and then if you rage shake it, it puts some noise into it. And I keep thinking, I can do something better than that. But this is kind of mimicking what it did on the show, because the little girl drops it, and it doesn't break. As the man says on the show, you can't break this instrument. Astrid does not say that. Please be very careful with it. So that's all it is. And it was a really interesting, it was an interesting process. Even like getting the lights to work was an interesting process. I need some diffusion under it. Haven't gotten that far yet. But this idea that it kind of comes, it sort of just waits for you to touch it, and then it comes to life. That's interesting too. And it was just a really simple instrument, but there's so much here. And I discovered so much because I was not leading with thinking about the technology. I was leading with thinking about, what is this thing as a storytelling device? What life does it have as an object? Then there's a whole universe of things to explore. And in the show, it's obviously it's easy. A child can play it. Anybody can play it. It's like Kickstarter over here. But the idea is that there's all you need to do is be calm and gentle with it, and it will reflect your mood. Although we only ever see one person play it. The old man she learns to play with, he's a master musician. He's got a Vulcan harp and everything. You never hear him play it. I'd like a word with the writers of season 1. Anyway, so that was what I made. And so here's some things that I learned through this process. And I feel like I really wanted to use this. But I also feel like I should blow your mind here, and I'm not sure if I'm going to. But the lessons that I learned was working backwards from a place where technology is not the most important element, or maybe not an element at all, really reoriented my design thinking. And part of me was like, how have I done this so much for so many years and never taken this angle? Forget it exists at all. What is it in the world? That was a really powerful perspective to adopt. I was limited not by the affordances of the technology, but by the imagination of what it could be. And the second thing is, thinking about what an instrument does and what it means, and extract from there how it works. And I didn't say what a player wants, or worse, what a user wants. But what is an instrument is a cultural artifact as an object in the world, and what does it do, what does it mean, and how does the functionality flow from that? Then I found that really made me look at sensors differently, made me look at the affordances that I had around me differently, was kind of adopting also that perspective. And the third thing is that watching Star Trek is never a waste of time. Mom, I'm joking, my mother never gave me nonsense about Star Trek. But I have a lot of people to thank for this little thing that I did. Andrew Probert, firstly, probert.artstation.com. Please go to his website. His drawings are, not now, after the talk. His drawings are amazing, and you'll really want to be a comic book artist when you look at his, they're just so beautiful. Chris Peck, who's a colleague of mine, who really informed the way that I think about sound design, especially for the next version that I'm going to make. Pete Hockey, who's my partner, who debugged PD code this weekend. Bless him, thank you. X-Hayden, my Hackspace, and of course, the good people at ADC. So thank you very much for listening. And if you want to get me on Discord, I am at Astrid. So thank you. Yeah, if you have questions, I'm happy to try to answer them.
If anybody has any questions.
Does this work? Okay. I noticed at the very beginning you actually likened a lot of the instruments on Star Trek to, say, some older folk instruments, and then you see some strange variant that is apparently somehow an accordion. But, I mean, how much of that is just this idea that, you know, Star Trek, you're thinking about something that's 500 years in the future, and is it just like the writers couldn't necessarily picture what real future instruments might be like if they were like going to be very far removed from anything we're familiar with, or just some expectation that music is just that universal that the same sorts of sounds or soundscapes would exist in some form throughout various alien cultures or something?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, one thing I like to do is go to the magic 8-ball of knowledge, which is scholar.google.com, and put in Star Trek, because the amount of scientific papers that quote Star Trek is astonishing. Everything from voice interfaces, I mean, computer, I mean, what is that if not Alexa? I think that the writers of Star Trek were very, very good at imagining completely future worlds and things that didn't exist, and have been very impactful in that way, and as particularly around scientific subjects. But I even read a paper that was on organizational psychology, like how people work together, and was using like the Star Trek engineering room as like a model for it. Amazing. But I think that the Star Trek writers had no shortage of imagination. But I think, and I don't want to criticize them because they did such beautiful work. And this is not, if any Star Trek writer ever watches this, it's not said with any kind of malice. But I think that they had a reductive idea of what music was. And that is, I think, so they kind of had this, well, it's an alien culture, but they're kind of like humans. They definitely speak different languages. They definitely don't look the same, music. And so that it wasn't sport, for instance. They could have picked many things, but it seemed to be music. That we can take that. But there also was not very much idea of what anything should sound like, or what really would make Vulcan music distinct from human music, and why. There was like no deep musicological thought here. So I think that there was, I don't know, I think maybe it was also a sign of the times. The fact that, the late 80s, late 60s were a different time when people thought about like what music is. And there was I think now that we're having conversations about the hegemony of Western classical music, for instance, maybe these days, if they were to write TNG again, it would be a bit different.
If I said, hello, Buck Rogers in the 25th century, have you considered looking at that?
Sorry?
Buck Rogers in the 25th century, the masterwork of Glenn A. Larson, you should have a look at that, because apparently disco is still a thing in the 25th century, and it's terrifying. So if you've got time, go look at some of those instruments. There aren't many, but It's genius.
Top tip.
You mentioned that the writers weren't very imaginative. Well, they were imaginative in certain ways, but not very imaginative about what we might value in music in the future.
Yeah.
That they had a very narrow understanding of what music is, what worthy and what isn't. Would you maybe think about for the next iteration of your instrument, including some non-Western scales or some like alternative ideas about what music might be valuable in your instrument, so you could maybe like in some way correct their failures of imagination there?
It's not about correct. There was no failure of imagination. It's just we have a broader idea. We have broader cultural conversations now. But that's a very good question. One thing that my colleague Chris Peck, who was very instrumental in helping me think about what this, like, we had a lot of conversations about this, and he works on tuning, and so does a colleague of mine, David Pockney, and they have really pushed my thinking in what would this sound like, because do I think it should be a 12-tet scale? Absolutely not. And it kind of pained me to make this, to recreate the sort of 4-part harmony, because would humans even still care about that? Would Eldeans care about that? I don't know. This idea that like 12-tet is somehow this holy grail of good music is a bit silly. One thing, the sound design that I've been working on for this is actually based on Pythagorean tuning. So this idea of like ratios of tunes. So it's not even like, and I don't like calling things non-Western scales. I mean, come on. There's a lot of Western scales that are not well represented anywhere. So I think so this idea of alternative tunings, that just like, that kind of othering, we need to get past it. What I'd like to do is have some sort of thing where there's mathematical relationships between things. I think ratios are a really nice way to think about tones. It can be microtonal, can be dissonant, doesn't matter. So I'm working on something with, tuning ratios for the final thing. So I thought that was a Chris thing. Chris put that bug in my ear. And I thought that's a really elegant way to get away from 12-tet, but also not fall into some sort of like, well, it's non-Western, we're so diverse. Like, it's not. That's a reductive way to look at broadening our musical language.
Hi, hello.
Hi, can you wave at me if you're asking a question?
I'm
Hello!
here. Hello.
Because I can't see from up here. Yeah, hi.
You as a musical instrument maker and researcher, how do you think that we can make these unusual instruments become usual? Like yesterday in the panel, like, they said like musicians, I put me in this, like we all want the guitar has the shape of a guitar and that stuff. So how we can make it to be like different shapes and different usability like in this way, because it was very, very interesting, like this instrument.
That's a good question. And I think that there's always, this is the case in all aspects of design, not just instrument design. There are these sort of conventions that we get used to. I mean, the QWERTY keyboard doesn't belong on a computer, but here we are. And so I'm not mad at that. What I think would really, what I would like to see more in the future is this notion of music technology not as supplying people endpoints, but supplying people tools and supplying people protocols. I was having this conversation with Rebecca last night, and I said, nobody tries to commoditize, so nobody tries to assume what anyone's gonna make with a pile of lumber. The lumber company's job is to make excellent lumber. And that's where I think there's a lot of innovation still to be had in music technology, is how to make those tools that are open, powerful, usable, understandable, that can allow people to like really go push their own design thinking really far instead of wrestling with the technology. Because I think that's what we need, is because once the technology is, and I don't like to say easy, but straightforward and knowable and learnable, then you start to really push what you can do with design. And that is, I think, the next step, personally. Please don't quote me. Hello.
Hi, so yeah, brilliant talk, thank you. And it made me think that the sort of inspirations that have come out of 20th century sci-fi for musical instruments and sound technology are largely kind of being fulfilled now. So where do you think the sort of next wave of inspiration for these things will come from?
Where do I think the next wave of inspiration is going to come from? Well, I don't think we've fully explored what sensing technology can do. Like I said, I mean, take an accelerometer to like a high, like you start getting high resolution accelerometer data, that's a whole new universe. It's no longer something going woo, woo. You can do so much more. So I think that is another place there's a lot of innovation to be had, is really, because with more powerful computers, and especially higher resolution sensing, you can do a lot more with that data, and that data becomes much more interesting and much deeper when you can visualize it, filter it, manipulate it. That's really exciting to me. So I don't think we need more technology. I think we need more, better ways to look at what we already have.
Thank you.
Hi, yeah, thanks for the talk.
Hello, where
it was
are you?
great. I'm there.
Hi.
Yesterday during the panel, something came up in the Q&A about the digital media that we're using and how to preserve that. And I was wondering, it seems to me that instruments are more and more electronics based. And it seems to me that it was a no-brainer for you to do something based on electronics. And today we can take a violin from 300 years ago, and there aren't that many that are preserved, but there's still a few. And I think it's quite unlikely that the electronics we made today will survive that long. And I was wondering what you thought about that.
That's such a good question, because, I mean, I think that in the next decades, we may not all live long enough to see the results of this, but bit rot is a thing, and digital archaeology, I think, will especially be a thing. I mean, who's tried to look at a Flash project from, like, 1999? You can't, surprise. And I think that digital, obsolescence is a lot faster than we give it credit for, because it seems like, oh, it's going to last for 20 years. And then you're 20 years down the line, you're like, it's not actually that long an amount of time. And so I think that's a really good question. I don't know what the answer to that is. Documentation, I guess, the task that everybody loves and does first. I think that maybe it's a question of infrastructure for sharing. Because you can say the same thing about music. Well, if you don't write it down, nobody will ever knew it existed. And I think that that's very much true. And also, I'm not convinced that everything that human beings do needs to be preserved for everybody forever. Maybe it doesn't. I mean, Bach's music was rediscovered because they found it boarding up a window. It was Mendelssohn who was like, is this sheet music? And was like, oh my God. And I mean, Bach was just like some guy. And then it was Mendelssohn finding that really like rejuvenated the, people's interest in Bach. So maybe that's okay. Maybe that's the way that human beings have always done things. But that doesn't mean like, don't care about it. But I don't know what the answer to that question is. I don't know what the logical endpoint is, but I think that's a really good point, is what do you do when everything's digital? Hiya.
I was thinking about a quote from Brian Eno where he said that the instruments that will endure through time are the ones that have like limited options. And in sort of the modern age of instruments that we're making, very software-based, like software synthesis, they seem to have almost like limitless options in terms of the sounds that they can create. Do you think that we're sort of broadening our horizons a little bit too much and taking away from actually using those instruments rather than sort of endlessly tinkering with them? Or do you think that things like pianos and violins have had their time and we want to broaden out?
I mean, it's a good question. I also think that I'm sure he intended that to apply only to electronic instruments. But I do think, well, how straightforward and limited in options do you think a violin is? And that's been around for ages. And so, yeah, I don't think that's what human beings respond to. I think there are a lot of lovely constrained musical instruments, and I'm a big fan of creative constraints, but I don't necessarily think that means it's going to be a thing forever. I mean, what's that weird little instrument called the automaton? It's like a little happy face that you squeeze and really cute. Super limited. People love it. There's like, and it's everywhere. But I think the other thing that we really need to focus on, if we're going to have really robust culturally informed conversations about musical instruments, is we cannot keep ignoring what the cultural context of these musical instruments is and go, well, it's going to persist if it has this many degrees of freedom, if it is this big, if it costs this much. No, it's going to persist if people use it to make things that they love. And I don't know if you can design for that. I think you can design to help, But I don't think that that's anything that any designer can be like, well, I'm going to hit a home run right here. Because if that was the case, we'd be doing it already, me and everybody else. And so I think that there's here's my tiny soapbox. This is one thing that I'm writing about a lot these days as well, is that this idea that musical instruments are somehow judged only on their affordances and their technical components and how they relate. Usually they're judged on, well, how does it relate to my practice? I would never use it, therefore it's useless. We're thinking about instruments in the wrong way. We need to start having a more culturally informed context and more culturally informed ideas around an instrument. So, I mean, the electric guitar, look at a distortion pedal. Distortion was an engineering headache, and all of a sudden, here's the late 60s, early 70s, Pentagram and Black Sabbath come along. Whoa, everyone's into distortion. And so I think a lot of times these things are accidental because it had cultural currency that distortion persists now, and it's such a big deal. Thank you, Pentagram and Black Sabbath. But I think I don't think the persistence is just in how many affordances, how easy it is to learn. People don't like to learn things. That's not true. People have been learning the violin for 500 years. It's really hard to play. Every musical instrument is really hard to play. So this idea it has to be easy, it has to have one button. Is that really true? Maybe sometimes it is, but I'm not convinced.
Hi. Hello, I'm here.
Where are you? Oh, hi. Right
Hi. I was just wondering what practical lessons we can take from your approach to designing instruments and more classic product development teams.
Practical. That's not usually my department. I do think that I think that from like a design perspective, what started to turn me on as a designer about this was just thinking about an instrument as a cultural object that is out in the world, that does something, that symbolizes something, and letting go of all of that technological baggage that I noticed I'm always bringing to the design process. That is, I think, probably the best practical takeaway I can suggest. Is it doesn't mean like that's always how you have to do it, but I think it's a really interesting thought exercise, is to think about these things as cultural objects with context and meaning that people love, and then like that's an interesting way to think about any piece of digital technology. So I think we think about them at various stages along their lifespan, and usually not at the widest possible point. Like, what is it in the spectrum of humanity? What meaning does it have? I think that's probably my best practical advice. I'm sorry.
Is this on? Hi, asking for a friend, Star Wars or Star Trek, and why?
I have time for both. I mean, did anyone see The Mandalorian? Oh my God, so good. But I mean, Trek forever, DS9, best Trek, fight me.
Hi.
Hey.
I was wondering if you could tell a story about the weird accordion. You said you had a story.
Okay, I will tell this story. Andrew Probert, when I contacted him, he sent me this production sketch of the Aldean instrument. It was so beautiful. And he said, I've also attached something else that I thought you might find interesting. It was for the accordion in Café des Artistes. And he was all in caps. What I designed is not what they built. And I looked at his design and it was so beautiful. What a drawing. It's this guy who was playing this like brown leather sort of thing, and it had all these colored buttons because like Andrew Probert loves a set of Letraset markers. Like he really like, they're very colorful. And it was this guy playing this sort of accordion thing, but it sort of fit in his hands. It was like a space age concertina. So beautiful. So of course I had to go right to Café des Artistes, and I was like, what is that? Like, do they have 10 minutes? Your budget is 50 cents. You have 11 minutes. Come up with something. So yeah, please go and watch that. It's called We'll Always Have Paris. Please go and watch that episode. You'll know exactly what I mean when you see it. The guy, and he plays it by moving those rings up and down, the giant tubes. So ridiculous. But what Andrew Probert had proposed was beautiful, but I guess they just didn't have the budget.
else, that's it.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.